So the police, I think, in Britain have been involved in three probably quite high-profile initiatives through three, I guess, categories of crime in recent years. I would say that they are those categories of crime are migration, so criminalising people who are migrants, identifying them as undocumented, particularly, of course, through the hostile environment policy, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. The second high-profile one, I would say, is around so-called knife crime or gang crime, which I guess was a war which was redeclared by David Cameron in 2011 in his so-called all-out war on gangs and gang culture. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And the third is the third category of crime is the war on terror and the use of the prevent agenda and the identifying of terrorists. And so all three of these categories of crime, I think, probably unsurprising to most people today, are implicated by race. Right? So race helps us to understand or identify who the immigrants are, who the gangsters are, and who the terrorists are. And so race plays a really fundamental role in the construction of these categories of crime. But in a practical way, and I think really importantly, there's huge overlap as well in the ways in which the police carry out the policing of suspected gangsters, terrorists, and immigrants. And that's through not just the kind of policing we might be familiar with in previous decades, but a partnership with schools, with hospitals, with places of work, with employers, with housing associations, lots of different areas of life. And I think this is important because it's one of the ways in which an expanded form of policing, which kind of invades many different spheres of public life, has become to be so normalised that when the lockdown took place, the expansion of police powers meant that they were kind of familiar and perhaps a bit more comfortable with policing the private and the public and the working lives of people identified or suspected of breaking lockdown rules, for which Black and minority ethnic people were also disproportionately policed. So, as I'm sure everyone's aware as well, we've seen huge protests throughout the world, but including Britain over the last few weeks. And I won't spend a lot of time going into detail about the background to that. I'm sure most people are familiar with the police killing of George Floyd in the United States and the context around that and the harrowing footage that we're all familiar with. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we have recently seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history, potentially. In over successive weeks, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people from across the country organised the anti-racist protests, and not just in big cities like Birmingham or Manchester or London or Bristol, but also in small towns and villages in parts of Wales and Northern England, where people have been organising vigils and other forms of political action in solidarity with what's been taking place in other parts of the country and the world. And I think this is really, really, I think it's difficult to not be inspired and energised by that. And I think the second thing about these protests, which is really positive, is the fact that they've overwhelmingly, particularly in the large cities, been organised by very young people. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of the protesters. I've been helping to provide, legal observers and arrestee support and all of that kind of stuff. And these are young people who look at me as somebody who's old at 33. These are people in their late teens, very early 20s, haven't really organised protests and campaign stuff before. They're kind of learning as they go, and I think it's difficult to again not be inspired by a new generation of anti-racist activists who are so energetic and effective at mobilising large groups of people. So in the first protest that I was doing the legal observing at, I noticed and was very surprised at how hands-off the police had been. Very, very hands-off indeed. A very thin police presence on the ground. It was almost a carnival-y atmosphere. You had some places where people were speaking. You had some Caribbean elders talking about the Windrush scandal. You had people playing music in other parts. You had community groups like London Campaign Against Police and State Violence handing out PPE. Lots of different it was a very festival atmosphere on Parliament Square or Hyde Park, or wherever it might have been. And I think it was around the second or third or fourth protest that I think the patience of the police began to dwindle. And we began to see the kind of policing which we might be more familiar with at large protests, particularly protests where there are significant numbers of young black people. So we saw riot police being used, we saw horses being used, we saw the tactic of kettle and mass arrest being deployed as well. And of course, alongside that, we saw the kind of stories and narratives that we're familiar with. So the idea that riot police, obviously heavily armoured with batons, flanked by officers on horses, charging, of course, at unarmed civilian protesters, was a response to some kind of violence. It's not a violence that I was aware of or saw, or any of our legal observers saw, but it was a narrative which the press picked up and parroted quite quickly. And I think what was perhaps most disturbing about this was, of course, the incident that caught most of the headlines, which was one police officer charging so virulently that they knocked themselves off of their horse. The first story which the press picked up on was that protesters dragged the police officer off their horse, which they then had to, of course, do a U-turn of once some camera phone footage emerged of the officer knocking themselves off the horse by riding into a traffic light. But I think what's also really important about this is that once the horse kind of broke free, it trampled on a young black girl, and this young black girl nearly died. She nearly lost her life because of this, and we've barely heard anything from her at all. And I think there was one interview with her on ITV News. The BBC has barely mentioned it at all, and in the interview on ITV News she said that she had to call the police didn't help her. She had to call the police to try to make a complaint. She's obviously, of course, badly bruised, very shook up. Her mobile phone was smashed to pieces, and she said that the response of the police was, well, if you're so concerned about your mobile phone, why don't you ask your people to pay for it? And so we're seeing here this, I think, a very different kind of attitude from the police, making their kind of being quite clever with the PR and arguing that these mainly often young black protests are being violent, and therefore this charging of police forces is something which is necessary. But also, I think, quite an intimidating approach through the kettling and the mass arrests, taking people's photographs, forcing them to compelling them to give their information to them, and again having this very dismissive attitude to this example of excessive use of force. But the police have been doing other things as well in relation to this. They've been using what are called gang injunctions. So gang injunctions are maybe a bit like ASBOs for those who are unfamiliar with them, or they might be similar to the control orders used in the prevent agenda, which prevent young people who don't necessarily have a criminal record or a criminal or a violent history, but for one reason or another have been put onto the police's gangs database, and it can prevent them from seeing specific people, going to specific places, using social media, a number of different kinds of injunctions. And what the police have been doing recently is identifying people that they say are not allowed to go to Black Lives Matter protests. Two quite high-profile ones are actually well-known rappers, Dutch Avelli and Digger. Very well-known, successful rappers at the moment who have been identified by the police and contacted because they've put Black Lives Matter pictures on their social media, and the police have said if you attend any Black Lives Matter protests, that will be in breach of your injunction. And the way they're doing that is linking the Black Lives Matter protests to violence, and they're saying that they're going there to engage in violence. So we're seeing the ways in which this policing of gangs and, by extension, particularly young black people, is being used not only to control their kind of private lives, but also to impede on their political freedoms as well of protest. Okay, so finally, I think I'm talking a little bit about, very briefly, just a little bit about some of the arguments that are being made and demands that are being made. Anyone reading the press would think that the main demand of these protests is to remove some statues, and that really hasn't been the case at all. Most of the demands have been around criminal justice reform, and of course on the more radical end, it's been about what we might call defunding of the police, or and this is premised on the idea that we can't solve our social problems through increasing the power of the police and prison system. And so therefore it's a demand of ending this war on gangs, ending the war on terror, ending the hostile environment policy, and rather investing in the community institutions, the youth clubs, mental health provision, particularly for young people, that can help the most vulnerable people in our society before they come into contact with the criminal justice system.
I first want to say, by means of introduction, that I am not optimistic that we are living at the moment when we can expect governments to deliver on racial justice. Change, if it comes, will come from below, which makes this actually a very dangerous moment, because there's so much hunger from change from below and governments are not listening. I'm going to talk about the long-term negative impact of the policing of COVID-19. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about prisons and what's happening in prisons today when prisoners have been locked up 23 hours a day during lockdown. I'm sad that we didn't follow some of the European lead here in terms of decarceration. But I hope that might be something that comes up in question and answers. So I want to talk mainly about the policing of COVID-19, but then I want to make some conclusions from that. I believe that we're facing two epidemics. We're facing the pandemic of this respiratory infection, and we're experiencing an epidemic of racial injustice. And that epidemic of racism is a race and a class issue, which is linked to the structural violence of austerity, cuts in services for the mentally ill, and the removal of support for those with addictions. This has accentuated the use of excessive force within the criminal justice system. Force and violence is being used to solve societal problems. This week, well actually today, later today on our news service, we're releasing a new report on 50 suspicious Black and migrant refugee deaths since 2014 in police custody, prisons and immigration removal centres. What is very significant in the 16 deaths that we have reported in terms of Black people killed by the police has been the use of batons, tasers, cuffs, sprays, dogs, and other forms of restraint on young Black men acting erratically, but not criminally, who have gone on to die in the custody of the police. And what is significant in these deaths is the frequency in which mental illness and drug possession or addiction are part of the scenario, which ends in death caused by the stress caused by restraint and a lack of care. This goes against the Angiolini review into deaths in police custody in 2017 that said that the use of force and restraint against anyone in a mental health crisis or suffering from some form of drug abuse, drug-induced psychosis, poses a life-threatening risk. So keep a look on our website. That report will be out hopefully by the end of today or tomorrow at the latest. So to turn to the lockdown, what do we know? Adam talked about the expansion of police powers during the lockdown and the disproportionate impact that this had on Black and minority ethnic communities. It did impact, not just in the UK, but around Europe in a disproportionate ways in terms of race, class and immigration status. Now, Vera earlier said, and she saw it as a positive thing, that there's been 20% less crime reported during the lockdown. Yeah, great, positive. So why, if there was 20% less crime, was stop and search used in London by the Metropolitan Police, where there was more stop and search in April 2020 than in April 2019? It just doesn't add up that the police were using their spare time to actually carry out more stop and search, probably on young Black, disproportionately on young Black people who live in high-rise estates. And, you know, when they venture out, they are subjected to stop and search. We've also had powerful images on social media, on ITV News recently, of people being tasered during lockdown, and all these cases will be challenged. This is also a question of the disproportionate arrest and fines of Black and other ethnic minorities in London. There's something in the newspaper today about that, some really shocking figures. Very much true in other parts of Europe. I saw some statistics recently from Saint-Denis, which is a department northeast of Paris, and it's home to some of France's poorest and most immigrant-rich districts. Saint-Denis accounted for 10% of all fines in France in the first day of lockdown. This tiny area was 10% of fines. But from my research around Europe, the biggest impact has been, or the worst impact, if one can have a hierarchy of impact, but some of the most frightening examples come from migrant communities and the Roma community. Adam set the scene for us here when he talked about the criminalisation of migration. For me, this is outrageous because some of these examples, which are from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, in terms of migrant workers, are people who are picking the crops that are keeping fruit and vegetables on our table during the lockdown. But what we have found is that for migrants and Roma, what they have experienced isn't anything like the lockdown that other people have experienced. It's been a form of targeted quarantine and militarized confinement. When the military builds separation walls and guard checkpoints with guns, when drones with thermal sensors are used to remotely take temperatures of residents in Roma settlements, we are not talking about proportionate coronavirus-related restrictions, but about targeted quarantine and militarized confinement. I haven't got time to go into it, but I've got some shocking examples of what police trade unions have said in relation to criticism of their policing. In France, where there was an attempt to ban police from using chokeholds, the police trade unions actually organised protests where they threw down their handcuffs in protest about these restrictions on dangerous chokeholds. We've also been looking with the monitoring group, which Adam is a part of, the whole question of racial violence during lockdown. Again, Vera told us about the significant priority given to domestic abuse victims, which is great. However, domestic abuse is not the only form of abuse that has hit the heights during the lockdown. Racial violence has hit the heights. Please read an interview on our news service with the monitoring group, which details a shocking rise in racial violence against South Asian communities, including women, mostly single parent women, who comprise 50% of the cases that they looked at. The same is very, very true across Europe. It's the same patterns. And I should say, I know we've got many people here from Poland in the audience, but a fantastic organisation called Never Again Association has documented COVID-19 racism in a very good report. And I know that their authors are now facing abuse from the far right. Don't have time to go into the policing of the Black Lives Matter protests. Adam has covered that absolutely conclusively. I would say, Kathy, there's a challenge here to the youth and children's sector, because enthusiasm for young people must include protecting them from criminalisation when they express their dismay about racial injustice. It also means in protecting them from violence. And there are some good initiatives here going on in America. And also in Sweden, because in other European countries, we've seen the use of tear gas and pepper spray used against young protesters. Now, as American medics have pointed out, you do not use tear gas at a time when you have a respiratory tract pandemic, because tear gas makes the respiratory tract more susceptible to infection, exacerbates existing inflammations, and induces coughing. Kettling is not a good idea during a pandemic. Mass arrests are not a good idea during a pandemic. The one positive example I've seen from Europe of a children's organisation taking a stand has been Save the Children in Sweden, who've put out a strong statement against the use of tear gas. To conclude, I would like to make 2 points about the power of change and where it can come from. It cannot come today from government. We can expect nothing positive on our racial justice to come from our government. I think in terms of how race relations is viewed, we are going back to the 1950s, where it was very prevalent that you'd see people in power when racism was discussed saying, oh, you know, it's just a perception, it's a feeling, black people have a chip on their shoulder. The recent review into COVID-19 race disparities, the farce of the government repressing the whole section that pointed to institutional racism, the fact that policymakers have been appointed to the Prime Minister's review, who've talked about anti-racism being a victim agenda and of a grievance culture amongst people who discuss or point to racism is not a good precedent. So the impetus for change will come from below, because only there is there a hunger for change. But that does not mean that those of us in institutions are absolved. We all have a choice. Are we part of the problem? Are we part of the solution? Can we stop the logic where stigmas are placed on communities, whether it's through the gang narrative, through the joint enterprise laws, or the prevent agenda? The positive legacy has to start with reflecting on the importance of the Minneapolis precedent to defund the police and return policing to a community service. What it is telling us is that we need not more force, but more care, which means embracing the positive things that come out of the mutual aid movement and reversing the damage done to communities by austerity, by cuts in legal aid, by leaving only force and not care, leaving incarceration and forgetting the power of restorative justice.
I think it would be useful to link up what's already happening with this movement to defund the police. There's already a huge non-compliance campaign movements, whether it be Docs Not Cops, where people are not complying with policing in our healthcare system, whether it be ABC schools to stop the criminalisation of young people in schools, whether it be young people suspected of being from an undocumented family, or the use of the gangs matrix, or the so-called public health approach, which tries to incorporate teachers into schools to identify so-called gang members, or the use of prevent in our education systems as well. Non-compliance with these kinds of initiatives, I think, is really important for eroding the legitimacy of this expansion of police powers. And we can also see it, of course, in councils and in housing and many other areas of public life as well. So I think this approach to non-compliance that's already happening, I think is really important for us to link with this these demands to defund the police. I think the other is that, of course, there are other forms of almost more active non-compliance that we're seeing as well. The fact that people are refusing to stand by and simply watch or walk away from abuses of police power. We're seeing more and more videos arising of people, whether it being stopped in their vehicles or being stopped during lockdown, or the use of tasers, as Liz mentioned, all of these types of things. And I think people are not just simply videoing them, but making a lot of noise about them, and again eroding the legitimacy of the police in this regard, and effectively trying to shame the government into some kind of action, which I think is possibly, particularly given their recent U-turn on free school meals during the summer holidays, shame is perhaps the only thing that this government responds to in a positive way.
It doesn't matter if you're an optimistic or a pessimist. What matters is that you're a realist. And the trouble with the discussion around disparities and disproportionality is that actually it doesn't deliver racial justice. It tinkers around with the system and it reduces disparity and disproportionality. But at the height or at the bottom of the experience for BME communities in the criminal justice system is what you call a swirling current of criminalisation, of young people being criminalised because they live in overcrowded conditions, they live in high-rise estates, in areas that are being gentrified. So actually, going back to the housing issue, it isn't just the question of poor housing, it's living in an area where you're being pushed back and you're being policed in a different way because you're seen as a threat to the gentrifiers. So to the examples that Adam gave about sort of really good initiatives to support, I would actually also suggest that we need to support groups working on what people call the Proofs to Prison pipeline. Children in bad housing then go to school who aren't eating properly, go to school and are considered disruptive pupils. They are then subjected in schools to restraint measures, to isolation booths before being taken and put in pupil referral units. Those are the children who most likely experience excessive policing. So basically, yes, I think we need to be very, very holistic around this and see the whole picture. There's a group called Black Learning Achievement and Mental Health UK, BLAM, who are working around the Proofs to Prison pipeline. So just wanted to add them to the groups that people might like to know more about.